Who is responsible if a person is injured in a slip and fall accident?
Well, that's a great question. I'd like to distinguish a slip and fall from a trip and fall. I think that people commonly use the phrase slip and fall to cover both, but there's actually a difference. If you slip, it's usually because something on the floor is wet or slippery and your feet go flying out from under you. You land on your back or your side. If you trip, it's usually because something is sticking up and causes you to catch your foot, and then your weight is still going forward. Typically you fall forward. So you're going to have different kinds of injuries, and it's very different in terms of what's causing the slip or the trip and fall. If you slip on something wet, that's a lot different than if you trip on something that's raised. Usually a slippery substance on the floor is something that isn't there permanently. Some water spilled, or you're in a grocery store, some lettuce or grape or banana or whatever it might be has been dropped to the floor. Whereas if you trip over something, it's usually a fixed object that's been there for a long time. That's an important distinction. So you ask who's responsible in a slip and fall. Let's say you go to a grocery store and slip on a lettuce leaf in the grocery department. It is not true that the store is automatically responsible. The rule is that in order for the store to be responsible, the condition must have existed long enough for the store or its employees to have been able to observe it, and they must have had an opportunity to pick it up, clean it up, or put up some kind of a warning sign, and they failed to do all of that. If an employee drops things on the floor, they're liable right away. But if it's a customer that came and dropped something on the floor, the store has to be given a reasonable opportunity. It might be a couple of minutes or so before they are charged with the duty to be aware of it and take some corrective action. So to say that the store is automatically responsible if you slip in, say, some milk that's spilled from a customer that's on the floor it's not accurate. They may be liable, they may not be liable, but you have to prove that they had a reasonable opportunity to become aware, or that they actually were aware of the problem and had a reasonable opportunity to fix it or warn about it or do something to prevent a customer or a person from falling in that slippery substance. So sometimes there may not be anyone that you can go after. It's certainly not useful to try to go after the customer who's not even there anymore, who might have slipped, put the slippery substance on the floor, dropped something. So that you can't just have a blanket rule, the store is always liable. On a trip and fall, which is different, that's usually talking about you trip over something that's raised. It could be a sidewalk which is uneven, or a sprinkler head that is sticking up that shouldn't be there. There's a lot of things that can cause a person to trip and fall. Usually the tripping hazard has been in place for a much longer time than, say, a substance when you're talking about a slip and fall. So when you have a tripping hazard, the owner of the property or the person that has control over that property would be held liable if the tripping hazard is a fairly serious or significant condition. Now, there's a couple other things I should mention. In terms of going back to slip and fall, sometimes you have slip and fall cases where people slip and fall on a slippery floor that might have just been cleaned by a janitorial service, where they mix too much soap in the cleansing fluids, or they didn't dry it off properly. And in that case, you would have a claim against both the owner of the property or the person that controls the property and the janitorial service that creates that slippery condition. One other thing I'd like to make a point of, these kinds of cases are often very difficult. Especially on trip and fall cases, there's the claim that if you look where you're going to see the hazard. So that you can expect to have a vigorous defense that you didn't look where you were going, and if you had been careful, you wouldn't have tripped. You'd have seen the hazard and avoided it. I hope that answers the question. It's not something that I can answer with a simple this person or that person's always liable.